Welcome to Englisher. Learn by listening. Your daily dose of English listening and learning practice. This content is used strictly for educational purposes to improve your English listening skills. It's also perfect if you're preparing for ELITES, TOEFL, or any language proficiency test. Don't just learn English, hear it, feel it, live it. This is part 1 of a multi-part English listening story. Make sure to follow the full series for complete learning. Let's begin today's practice.
The Man Without a Country by Edward Everett Hale. Reading by Roddy Delaney. I suppose that very few casual readers of the New York Herald of August 18th observed, in an obscure corner, among the deaths, the announcement, Nolan, died on board U.S. corvette Levant, latitude 2 degrees 11 minutes south, longitude 131 degrees west, on the 11th of May, Philip Nolan. I happened to observe it because I was stranded at the old mission house in Mackinac, waiting for a Lake Superior steamer which did not choose to come, and I was devouring to the very stubble all the current literature I could get a hold of, even down to the deaths and marriages in the Herald. My memory for names and people is good, and the reader will see, as he goes on, that I had reason enough to remember Philip Nolan. There are hundreds of readers who would have paused at that announcement, if the officer of the Levant who reported it had chosen to make it thus: died, May 11th, the Man Without a Country. For it was as the Man Without a Country that poor Philip Nolan had been generally known by the officers who had had him in charge during some 50 years, as, indeed, by all the men who had sailed under them. I dare say there is many a man who has taken wine with him once a fortnight in a 3 years' cruise, who never knew that his name was Nolan, or whether the poor wretch had any name at all. There can now be no possible harm in telling this poor creature's story. Reason enough there has been till now, ever since Madison's administration went out in 1817, for very strict secrecy, the secrecy of honor itself, among the gentlemen of the Navy who have had Nolan in successive charge, and certainly it speaks well for the esprit de corps of the profession and the personal honor of its members that to the press this man's story has been wholly unknown, and I think to the country at large also. I have reason to think, from some investigations I have made in the Naval Archives when I was attached to the Bureau of Construction, that every official report relating to him was burned when Ross burned the public buildings at Washington. One of the Tuckers, or possibly one of the Watsons, had Nolan in charge at the end of the war, and when, upon returning from his cruise, he reported at Washington to one of the Crown and Shields, who was in the Navy Department when he came home, he found that the department ignored the whole business. Whether they really knew nothing about it, or whether it was non me ricordo determined on as a piece of policy, I do not know. But this I do know, that since 1817, and possibly before, no naval officer has mentioned Nolan in his report of a cruise. But, as I say, there is no need for secrecy any longer, and now the poor creature is dead, it seems to me worth while to tell a little of his story, by way of showing young Americans of today what it is to be a man without a country. Philip Nolan was as fine a young officer as there was in the Legion of the West, as the Western Division of our army was then called. When Aaron Burr made his first dashing expedition down to Orleans in 1805 at Fort Massac, or somewhere above on the river, he met, as the devil would have it, this gay, dashing, bright young fellow at some dinner party, I think. Burr marked him, talked to him, walked with him, took a day or two's voyage on his flatboat, and, in short, fascinated him. For the next year, barrack life was very tame for poor Nolan. He occasionally availed himself of the permission the great man had given him to write to him. Long, high-worded, stilted letters the poor boy wrote and rewrote and copied, but never a line did he have in reply from the gay deceiver. The other boys in the garrison sneered at him, because he sacrificed in this unrequited affection for a politician the time that they devoted to the Monongahela, Hazard, and High-Low Jack. Bourbon, euchre, and poker were still unknown, but one day Nolan had his revenge. This time Burr came down the river, not as an attorney seeking a place for his office, but as a distinguished conqueror. He had defeated I know not how many district attorneys. He had dined at I know not how many public dinners. He had been heralded in I know not how many weekly Arguses, and it was rumored that he had an army behind him and an empire before him. It was a great day, his arrival, to poor Nolan. Burr had not been at the fort an hour before he sent for him. That evening he asked Nolan to take him out in his skiff, to show him a canebrake or a cottonwood tree, as he said, really to seduce him. And by the time the sail was over, Nolan was enlisted body and soul. From that time, though he did not yet know it, he lived as a man without a country. What Burr meant to do, I know no more than you, dear reader. It is none of our business just now. Only, when the grand catastrophe came, and Jefferson and the House of Virginia of that day undertook to break on the wheel all the possible clearances of the then House of New York, by the great treason trial at Richmond, some of the lesser fry in that distant Mississippi Valley, which is farther from us than Puget Sound is today, introduced the like novelty on their provincial stage, and, to while away the monotony of the summer at Fort Adams, got up, for spectacles, a string of court-martials on the officers there. One and another of the colonels and majors was tried, and, to fill out the list, little Nolan, against whom, heaven knows, there was evidence enough that he was sick of the service, had been willing to be false to it, and would have obeyed any order to march any whither with any one who would follow him had the order been signed by command of His Excellency A. Burr. The courts dragged on. The big flies escaped, rightly for all I know. Nolan was proved guilty, as I say, yet you and I would never have heard of him, reader, but that, when the president of the court asked him at the close whether he wished to say anything to show that he had always been faithful to the United States, he cried out in a fit of frenzy, "Damn the United States! I wish I may never hear of the United States again." I suppose he did not know how the words shocked Colonel Morgan, who was holding the court. Half of the officers who sat in it had served through the Revolution, and their lives, not to say their necks, had been risked for the very idea he so cavalierly cursed in his madness. He, on his part, had grown up in the West of those days, in the midst of the Spanish plot, Orleans plot, and all the rest. He had been educated on a plantation, where the finest company was a Spanish officer or a French merchant from Orleans. His education, such as it was, had been perfected in commercial expeditions to Vera Cruz, and I think he told me his father once hired an Englishman to be a private tutor for a winter on the plantation. He spent half his youth with an older brother hunting horses in Texas, and to him United States was scarcely a reality. Yet he had been fed by United States for all the years since he had been in the army. He had sworn on his faith as a Christian to be true to United States. It was United States which gave him the uniform he wore and the sword by his side. Nay, my poor Nolan, it was only because United States had picked you out first as one of her own confidential men of honor that A. Burr cared for you a straw more than for the flatboat men who sailed his ark for him. I do not excuse Nolan. I only explain to the reader why he damned his country and wished he might never hear her name again. He never did hear her name but once again. From that moment, September 23rd, 1807, till the day he died, May 11th, 1863, he never heard her name again. For that half-century and more, he was a man without a country. Old Morgan, as I said, was terribly shocked. If Nolan had compared George Washington to Benedict Arnold, or had cried "God save King George," Morgan would not have felt worse. He called the court into his private room, and returned in 15 minutes, with a face like a sheet, to say, "Prisoner, hear the sentence of the court. The court decides, subject to the approval of the President, that you never hear the name United States again." Nolan laughed, but nobody else laughed. Old Morgan was too solemn, and the whole room was hushed dead as night for a minute. Even Nolan lost his swagger in a moment. Then Morgan added, "Mr. Marshal, take the prisoner to Orleans in an armed boat, and deliver him to the naval commander there." The marshal gave his orders, and the prisoner was taken out of the court. "Mr. Marshal," continued old Morgan, "see that no one mentions the United States to the prisoner. Mr. Marshal, make my respects to Lieutenant Mitchell at Orleans, and request him to order that no one shall mention the United States to the prisoner while he is on board ship. You will receive your written orders from the officer on duty here this evening. The court is adjourned without day." I have always supposed that Colonel Morgan himself took the proceedings of the court to Washington City and explained them to Mr. Jefferson. Certain it is that the President approved them. Certain, that is, if I may believe the men who say they have seen his signature. Before the Nautilus got round from New Orleans to the North Atlantic coast with the prisoner on board, the sentence had been approved, and he was a man without a country.
End of Part 1. For Part 2, or more part to follow the playlist. Thank you for listening with Englisher. Learn by listening. All audio used is from LibriVox and is in the public domain. This practice session helps improve your listening comprehension. Useful for elites, TOEFL, and other language exams. Like, subscribe, and share if you found this helpful. Comment your favorite word or moment from today's practice. See you in the next one.